I will be talking to you today on the Radiology of Egyptian Mummification's Evisceration tradition. Now, evisceration, whether by transabdominal or transperineal incision, or by cedar oil enema, is a well-recognized component of the Egyptian mummification tradition. In spite of the high degree of variability apparent in the literature in aggregate, research continues to focus on modern and classical stereotypes rather than the rich variability in Egyptian mummification. These stereotypes, however, can be used to formulate a hypothesis that can be empirically tested. If the oft-repeated classical accounts are correct, then evisceration via abdominal incision should be restricted to the elite. Anal chemical evisceration should be well represented and be present primarily in commoners' remains. And the heart should be present in the overwhelming majority of eviscerated mummies. Ancient Egyptian descriptions of the mummification process are extremely rare, limited to a couple of papyri describing ritual elements associated with embalming and a few scenes from the late period costume. Few studies, however, fail to mention the likely second-hand account of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, including evisceration via abdominal incision and evisceration via corrosive enema. Yes, it's as unpleasant as it sounds. Diodorus Siculus provides further details, including retention of the heart and the existence of a specialist, Paraskistes, who was ritually chastised with pelting with stones after making the abdominal incision. Transabdominal evisceration was achieved through the creation of a short incision in the side of the abdomen, originally performed as a vertical incision at the level of the hypochondria, just below the ribs, and later as a diagonal incision along the iliopubic line. In one recorded case, and that one possibly a Nubian knockoff, the incision has been made on the left side. And the incision was frequently plugged or covered with linen and resin. In some cases, the lips of the incision are sutured, or a plate of wax or metal in the shape of the wedge-jet eye of Horus associated with healing was placed over the incision. A second category of eviscerated mummies does not exhibit an abdominal incision. Three types, anal, vaginal, and perineal, are considered here as a single group of transperineal eviscerations. This is owing to the often ambiguous appearance of the incision's placement, to difficulty in visualizing folded and compressed structures in this area, and the complications arising from packing and plugging of the orifices. Individuals eviscerated transperineally are also often considered to have undergone cedar oil enema, Herodotus. And while the effectiveness of this method has been disputed, experiments have shown the efficacy of a turpentine and juniper oil enema, which is apparently more likely than cedar oil, in dissolving the viscera and sparing the heart. And in addition to these evisceration treatments, numerous natural and anthropogenic, that is man-made mummies, retain their internal organs in various states of preservation. The difficulty in accurately assessing the tissues of the body cavity arises from the greatly reduced size and density contrast of desiccated tissues, and of course to the incision and excision of tissues, obscuring shapes and destroying anatomical relationships. The three-dimensional information available in CT scans, computed tomography, particularly the high spatial resolutions in the current generation of scanners, provides an ideal means by which to non-destructively examine mummified human remains for the details of evisceration. That is a three-dimensional view of the interior of the torso, unhampered by superimposition. It's characteristic of plain film radiographs. Now, most of you may know plain film radiographs work by sending X-ray radiation through an object and seeing how much of that radiation gets through. More dense structures filter out more X-rays, and so expose the film less. And all of the structures are superimposed on one another, taking a 3D object and reducing it to a 2D projection. Computed tomography, CAT scan, CT, also makes use of X-rays, projecting them through an object to a series of detectors on the far side. But a CT X-ray source rotates around the object while it does so. As it rotates, we get views of the object from hundreds of angles. You can compute the 3D layout of the object. And it does this one tiny slice at a time. You can then stack all of these slices and produce a 3D reconstruction of the object. And that's what we do with the CT. The route of evisceration is often easily discerned. The embalming incision on the left abdominal wall is easily appreciable in CT scans. The presence of an incision plate, however, may be the only indication of transabdominal evisceration in plain films. Perineal forms may be substantially more difficult to differentiate with large amounts of resin in the perineum and the compaction of lucent structures, as I mentioned. The lungs and heart are readily identifiable by their position. The heart, when it's retained in the chest, appears as a dense mass suspended in the pericardium, while the lungs remain as thin, flat structures in the dependent portion of the thoracic cavity, not pictured here, and may appear as patchy opacity in chest films. The pericardium itself appears as a linear opacity, tethered between the sternum, thoracic spine, and diaphragm. The liver appears as a dense mass, reduced in size, but retaining its shape. And the intestine, stomach, and urinary bladder are reduced to fine, easily disrupted structures, again appearing as linear opacities, although if we're lucky enough to get some fecal matter in there, we may see characteristic bowel loops. Come on, who doesn't want to see characteristic bowel loops? So with these features in mind, the study made use of two samples. A sample of 150 mummies described in the literature, and a sample of 7 mummies examined directly. Now, for individuals to be suitable for the study, the literature must have contained individual dating of the mummies to dynasty or period, and explicit, non-conflicting descriptions and illustrations of the body cavity and organ treatment used. Where available information on specific organs, sex, and socioeconomic status were also collected from these individuals. Status in particular divided the mummies into elite and commoner remains, following chemical categories of literate men wielding authority derived from the king, and those subordinate to them, doorkeepers, soldiers, quartermen, and so on. And then, of course, the illiterate peasantry who were not anthropogenically mummified. The smaller sample, second sample, was drawn from mummies for which original CT data was available. The mummies in this sample include the Redpath Museum's Red 2 mummy, the Royal Ontario Museum mummies Rom 910.5.3, dubbed Justine during her time at the University of Western Ontario, and Jed Madison, Hetep Bastet from the Université de Quebec à Montréal, Ha'ib at the Barnum Museum, Clio at the Chatham-Kent Museum, and Lady Hudson House at Western. Of the 150 mummies included in this study, 114 of them were eviscerated in some fashion. Body cavity treatments included 63 trans-abdominal eviscerations, 9 transperineal eviscerations, including 4 cases reported specifically as per annum, or anal, and 36 cases exhibiting no signs of evisceration. And you'll note all those numbers don't all add up. The details of the route of evisceration, the nature and position of packing materials, and especially the presence and absence of specific organs, are frequently not reported in the literature. Often even the basic features had to be logically inferred from the available information. This study obtained sufficient information to closely examine the presence of evisceration, the trans-abdominal and transperineal types of evisceration, and the presence of the heart, which were all key to evaluating our hypothesis. Now, the earliest examples of evisceration in this sample come from elites in the Old Kingdom, with increased overall and proportionally in evisceration in the New Kingdom. This continued in the Third Intermediate period, and steady high incidences and prevalences existed until the end of the Roman period. Evisceration began among the males and elites, and does not appear among women in this sample until the New Kingdom, nor, as in the case of evisceration generally, males and elites predate females and commoners receiving this. Although the elite were being eviscerated in earlier periods than noted here, detailed data for mummies prior to the Middle Kingdom are not readily available in the literature, often due to the lack of preserved soft tissue. Following trans-abdominal evisceration in popularity was the absence of evisceration, about 24% of this sample. And of course, it's the earliest mummies that exhibit this absence of evisceration, and it's primarily found in females in the early dynastic period. The transperineal forms, including per-annum evisceration, were rarely applied to individuals in this sample, approximately 8%. Transperineal eviscerations began among elites in the Third Intermediate period and remained in elite practice throughout its use. The heart was noted as intact in only 21 of 80 individuals where this organ's disposition was recorded. The heart was noted as intact, specifically in elites as early as the Middle Kingdom, and the incidence of heart retention increased over time, but decreased in prevalence beginning in the New Kingdom, and especially in the Third Intermediate. So evisceration has been an important feature of Egyptian anthropogenic mummification since its inception in the early Kingdom. The sex and status distributions here are in agreement with observations that new mummification features, like all new advantages, reverse the privilege of Pharaoh, then increasingly permissive to progressively lower social classes. The increase in incidence and prevalence from the New Kingdom and Third Intermediate period, as well as the inclusion of non-pharaonic groups receiving evisceration, coincides with the democratization of mummification in the New Kingdom. Interestingly, the perineal forms of evisceration appear relatively late, Third Intermediate period, and do not first occur in male elites. Prior to the Third Intermediate period, few mummified women were eviscerated, and it's in this group the transperineal eviscerations begin. Now, one explanation is that the method presented itself as an option and did so more readily in the female anatomy. The pseudo-prolapse of the anus and vagina together may have been quite pronounced, particularly among noble females, whose mummification was purportedly delayed for several days to deter necrophiles. We get that from Herodotus. And the obvious option to remove the viscera without producing any unnecessary new holes may have appealed to the embalmers and to their beleaguered paraschistes. Regardless of the reason for the introduction of perineal forms of evisceration, their application begins and remains among the elite and should not be considered a second-rate option. Reasons for wanting to preserve the heart seem clear, and scarabs inscribed in the chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead provide ample evidence for the importance of the heart. The heart animated the body, commanded the limbs, and according to the importance placed on it as the seat of intelligence and emotion, the heart is now often described as always being left intact, returned if accidentally removed, or replaced with an inscribed heart scarab. As I said, in barely more than a quarter of the individuals in the sample has the heart remained in place. With the heart enclosed in its pericardial sac and connected by 6 major vessels, in addition to the pulmonary veins and arteries severed in lung removal, it's fanciful to consider the possibility of accidentally being removed by a slip of the scalp. More so when such incidents would have to occur in nearly 7 of every 10 cases, and followed by the loss of this very important organ in more than 98% of those cases. The heart absence has also coincided with retention of the lungs, further condemning the case for accidental excision. So mummies were increasingly absent their hearts from the New Kingdom on. Although the data are insufficient to closely examine the sex and status associations of these individuals, it's likely that retention of the heart began among the elite, the male elite, that is, as befits its importance as the seat of intelligence and emotion. As time progressed, the nobles gained increasing access to mummification and retained their hearts. With the democratization of mummification, however, the commoners being mummified were not receiving the same treatment, possibly to ensure that the elite maintained a more favorable afterlife than their subjects. So this study demonstrates the difficulty in relying on the classical stereotypes of others, such as Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus. In spite of the lack of detail present in descriptions of mummies throughout much of the literature, there is substantial evidence for variability in the mummification tradition, and for that variation's contradiction of the classical descriptions. This study addresses the hypothesis that were the descriptions of evisceration by Herodotus and Diodorus accurate and adequately representative, one would expect to see, as I said, transabdominal evisceration only in the elite, frequent anal enema evisceration among the commoners, and near universal retention of the heart in eviscerated mummies. Rather, what we see, and what the empirical data show us, is that transabdominal evisceration occurs in large numbers in both social classes. Not only are anal enema eviscerations not clearly present, evisceration by any means in the perineal region is restricted to elites in a few cases that are reported. And finally, the position that the heart was always left in place, returned if accidentally removed, or replaced with a heart scarab if not returned, is far from the truth. The hypothesis constructed from the stereotyped accounts by Herodotus and Diodorus is therefore falsified, and these classical accounts must no longer be taken as the de facto rule for Egyptian mummification. The classical descriptions should be considered as, at best, a possible snapshot of mummification performed by one particular worker. A snapshot that does not express the full variability, full range of variability practice throughout the entirety of ancient Egypt over the course of 3 millennia, nor necessarily even the period in which the account was written.